okay? So I'm going to begin sort of from a little bit of a historical perspective, but I think you'll all recognize most of this kind of stuff. You don't have to be an architecture student. Ancient monuments, memorials, had several things in common. They were almost always massive. They were monolithic, that is, they were a singular form. And most of the time, they actually performed a task, which was to mark a burial ground and to mark giant events in life, birth, death, sometimes the change of seasons because it had so much to do with harvest and everything like that. So these ancient monuments, like the pyramids in Egypt, or Stonehenge, or just burial mounds, all shared these characteristics. And these were to be observed, but not necessarily to be really engaged with. The exception there, I guess, being Stonehenge, where that is a bit more experiential, but for the purposes of this first part of the talk, it's the monumental singular form that we're paying attention to. But very quickly, when we enter the classical period, let's say 2,000 years ago, roughly, we start to see a different kind of memorial. We see temples, sculptures, things that are composed as opposed to a singular thing like a mound or a pyramid. We see composition, self-conscious composition taking place. And we see hierarchy. Now, at some level, even the ancient monuments had a hierarchy, i.e., only the pharaoh got a pyramid. The accountant did not. It was just the pharaoh. So there was a hierarchy, very, very clear hierarchy communicated there. But temples are an example of the sort of classical memorial or monument. So is something like the Tempietto in Rome by Bramante, which is from the Renaissance, but the Renaissance is a resurgence of classicism. How many of you have been to Rome? Anybody in here been to Rome? Have you seen this building, the Tempietto? Yes? Yeah, it's pretty astonishing. It's tiny, as its name would suggest. Not a temple, but a Tempietto. And other monuments and memorials that are closer to home in this country, of course, the most significant battlefield in the United States is at Gettysburg. For those of you who don't know, the Battle of Gettysburg was really the tipping battle of the American Civil War. July 1, 2, and 3 of 1863, the Union Army finally asserted itself successfully against Robert E. Lee's army at Gettysburg. And one of the great generals of that battle was Longstreet, James Longstreet. And he is memorialized here as a dynamic action figure actually in battle. This is as opposed to a classical sculpture of a kind of idealized person. Sometimes the purpose of the sculpture is simply evidence. The many Civil War battlefields, and probably some from the American Revolutionary War, and also in Second World War battlefields in Europe, we see evidence of what took place. Not just the human evidence, but like actual cannons and military hardware, that is left there so that one will never forget what took place there. But we also see entire buildings that serve as memorials. How many of you have been to Harvard's campus since you've been here? You should go. It's a pretty interesting place. And it's also not very far away. It's super easy to get to. But if you go there, you'll see this astonishing building, which when you see it, you'll say, that, I've never been surer of anything in my life, that is a church. That has to be a church. Well, not only is it not a church, it never was a church. That's even harder to believe. It was designed and built as a memorial to war dead from the Harvard community. It's used as a sort of as a student center, and there's a great performance hall in this space. But it was never a church. Nothing looks more like a church that was never a church than this building. If you've been to Los Angeles, you know the LA Coliseum. So now we have a building that's not even doesn't have any overtones of memory or gravity or seriousness or religion or anything like that. This is where the sports teams play. So the idea that the memory of war dead or other venerated people could be preserved not only in a mournful cemetery-like setting, but in everyday life. Now we're starting to sense how memorials and experience are connected. Because every time you go to the LA Memorial Coliseum, or every time you go to Memorial Hall at Harvard, in principle, you are to be reminded of something that you might otherwise forget. Memorials exist because we have short attention spans. I know that's hard for you to believe, but it's true. We have short attention spans, and today's crisis, unique, one-of-a-kind crisis, quickly dissolves into yesterday's news. We don't want it to, but it does. Our daily lives overtake us, and memorials are necessary to help us remember, maybe to coerce us to remember. In Berlin, there's a war memorial at the center of one of the main parks, in a giant roundabout, and that it has an axis that runs down the middle of it, just so you don't, just so you don't forget its importance. That says where to go, not where to G. But contemporary memorials are a different thing altogether. This is when the experiential really becomes more of a thing. And in a way you can understand why. If the modern era is very much about, ever since the Enlightenment, the modern era is about empowering the individual as opposed to the group, right? I mean, when you were a citizen in ancient Egypt, you were part of a group only, okay? There was a pharaoh and there was everybody else. Beginning in the Enlightenment, we see the empowerment of the individual. You know the famous saying by René Descartes, the French philosopher, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. It's about what I do. It's not about what the world does to me. The invention, for those of us who are actively in the design field, the invention of linear perspective, constructed perspective drawing, changed everything in the visual world, because suddenly you were seeing the world from the point of view, think empathy, from the point of view of the observer, not the point of view of God. If you look at pre-Renaissance painting, you often see the world depicted vaguely from above. Not realistically in the contemporary sense of the word, but sort of vaguely from above. Or you see a very flat world. You see, for example, in Christian painting, for example, you'll see Christ's head or the Virgin Mary's head against an illuminated golden background, but it is flat. It's not perspectival. It is not from the point of view of an individual person. It's from just a singular general point of view. Well, and what I'm getting at, for example, is in this room, your point of view, looking at me from where you are, is fundamentally different from your point of view, looking at me from over there. If I asked you to take a snapshot from your perspective, they would not be the same at all. So that's what I'm getting at by dwelling on perspective. And it's not an accident that the term perspective it describes both a drawing style and a point of view. Saying something is true from my perspective means from where I stand, that's what I see. So that's why memorials started to become less singular, less monolithic, less understandable only one way. They became individual, tactile, abstract, and they engaged the landscape more because the landscape is the ground through which we move. So let's look at some examples. This is a famous Holocaust memorial in Poland that is fundamentally about a civilization, a people rent asunder, torn apart, broken in half. And it's something that you walk down. You don't just look at it from a distance. You engage this. Even closer to home, there's another Holocaust memorial here in Boston, right near Boston City Hall. If you've been down to Faneuil Hall, Marketplace area, you may have seen this. And this is very powerful because you really do walk through it. There's 6 glass shafts, and there's sort of steam coming up underneath them. Some would say an overly explicit or literal reference to the death camps, but nevertheless, it is something you can walk through and experience. By the way, something worth noting, because this is really brilliantly done. It's designed by a South African architect named Stanley Sadowitz. And there are not names on this. You know, in many memorials, that's the primary task. Like if you think about a gravestone, which is a memorial, right? What is the essential thing to have on the gravestone? It's the name of the dead person, right? So you know who it is. Like that's like the lowest performance criterion possible for a gravestone. Then the second item might be when they were born and when they died. And then in some cases, you get more information like, you know, Thomas Jefferson was president of the United States and created the University of Virginia and wrote the Virginia Treatise on Religious Freedom, that sort of stuff. But this doesn't have anything like that. Instead, what it has is a limitless number of numbers, sort of random numbers. And what that kind of communicates, I would say, is this sort of uncountable, the futility of counting in the Holocaust. And this is a point of view of some Holocaust scholars, I think, that to even talk about numbers is to make a pedestrian or everyday of something that I think for many Jews is a calamity of the lifetime. Obviously, there are many others from other points of view. I cite that just because we're looking at this memorial. But there are other kinds of monumental designs that are even more abstract. This is a landscape design by Maya Lin, and we'll look at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in just a moment. But this is really interesting. First of all, it's called Wave Field, and it's just a molded landscape. But the molding of the landscape suggests that there's something inside it. There's something under that grass. I don't know about for you, but for me, it suggests the human body, and that there might be bodies in this field. And I'll show you some. It's kind of at the scale of a human body, and I'll show you another example here in just a second. This is very interesting, I think, and it's quite beautiful too. It's not clear that it's attempting to cause you to remember anything in particular. But it's a very interesting form. This, however, is a model, not the actual thing. This thing is actually built now in Berlin. This is the American architect Peter Eisenman's memorial to the Holocaust in Berlin, Germany. And this has, and I'm sorry I don't have close-up photographs, but this is a series of slabs that are, let's say, 3 feet by 10 feet in dimension, and then varying depth because the ground adjacent to these slabs rises and falls. So that at some locations, the slab is only this high and you can sit on it. In other locations, the slabs are this high and you're walking in a sort of grid of them. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because you can see and understand the enormity of all of these vaguely casket-sized slabs. In other words, when you're walking down the street, right near Potsdamer Platz, right near the Brandenburg Gate at the heart of Berlin, you can see the enormity of what happened, but you can also get lost in it. In other words, you can enter and walk between these slabs and find yourself kind of in the darkness. And you'll see when we get to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial how powerful that is. And it's completely tied to movement. You can't apprehend or comprehend this memorial without moving through it. That's very different from the pyramids, okay? The pyramid, or the pyramids, they achieve their effect from almost any point of view. They're brilliant, by the way. I mean, these are genius works of art, I think. Among the great, the things I've shown you are not just everyday affairs. They're sort of historically very important works, but they're different and they operate differently, and that's what you have to be mindful of. Part of this whole idea of experience means that you can end up creating memorials out of things you never thought you would. There's no way the Egyptians or the Greeks would have said, we're going to make some steps the memorial itself. Now, you might have gone up some steps to get to a Greek temple, but that was not the thing itself. Here, you can see as a way, I think, to get people, this is on a campus, to get people, just as they're shuffling through their everyday routines, to apprehend and to comprehend the message that is engraved on the steps. If they're watching where they're going, which I admit is not always the case, they're going to see this. And so it can really be part of the everyday life and not only the exalted life. So with that, let's get to the incomparable Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Let's just give you a little bit of context first. This is a very international class. From the point of view of the United States, the Vietnam War lasted roughly from 1959 or 1960, when the very first advisors were sent, to 1975, when the helicopters famously, that last helicopter left Saigon, Vietnam, conceding to the North Vietnamese and what is now Vietnam. And of course, this was a tremendously, this was a war filled with lots of social conflict at home. In the United States, there was a lot of domestic opposition as well as domestic support. You know, very much like contemporary politics, except this time it was about a war. And so one thing that is, and of course there was tremendous outrage on the part of many Americans that the servicemen, the people who had served as soldiers in the Vietnam War, were not treated well when they returned by some of their fellow citizens. And this was a source of great outrage. So it may be the reason why a memorial to the Vietnam War dead was built so quickly, because this is a very important point. Think about it. Memorials are usually, well, it's changed a little bit in our contemporary era, but usually they happen years, decades, often generations after the thing being memorialized. And there's a good reason for that. Because first, before you build a memorial, you should probably figure out if in fact this event being memorialized proves to be as historically significant as you think it is at the time, right? We all think every calamity or every war or every awful thing that happens in our time is got to be the worst thing that's ever happened. But history tends to sort of lay that out for us. You know, yes, the First World War turned out to be a really significant thing, and there are lots of memorials to that effect. The Second World War, really significant thing. But the monument to the memorial to the Second World War was only built in Washington about 10 years ago, about 60 or 70 years after the war. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial was built in the early 80s. Astonishing, like 6 years after the conflict. What else is astonishing? Again, for an international audience, as with many wars, you know, the opponent is dehumanized, right? So in the Second World War, American propaganda tried to dehumanize Germans and Japanese. In England, they would dehumanize the Germans, and the Germans would try to dehumanize us and their opponents. This is very normal. In the United States, I think there was certainly there was that in the Second World War. As you probably know, the United States interred lots of Japanese on the West Coast who were American citizens, but they were interred as potential aggressors nonetheless. In this war, I think there was a anti-Asian sentiment in the Vietnam War. And so it is all the more interesting and surprising that in an anonymous international design competition to design this memorial only 6 years after the war, the winner was selected. It was a 20-year-old Asian woman who was a freshman in architecture at Yale, Maya Lin. Now, if this had happened through the normal political channels, there's just no way that would have happened. And I think it is particularly powerful that in a war, or in a memorial about such a controversial conflict, that the selection was an entirely merit-based thing, and I'm delighted about that. What I mean is, this was not really, building anything in Washington, D.C. is a political process, but the design competition was really a proper one. It was, no names, just people reviewing the work and selecting what they thought was the most powerful thing. So let's talk about what that most powerful thing is a bit. What you see there is what I have circled there is the location of the memorial, and I'm just going to step away from the podium here for just a second. And so just for those of you who probably aren't super familiar with the plan of Washington, D.C., it's our most designed city in the United States. There's few others, there are a couple of others. Most American cities grow completely in a very ad hoc way. Private development, private choices yield the end result. This is a French city. Washington, D.C. is a French city. It is designed by Pierre L'Enfant, a general in the French army in 1792. And I say it's French because it's incredibly rational and geometric and hierarchical, like France. If you've ever been to Versailles, the gardens at Versailles and the palace at Versailles, or if you've been to Paris, Paris is for the most part, the Champs-Élysées, the grand avenues, it's all very, very rational and hierarchical. That rationality and hierarchy are used in the plan of Washington to make the whole city a monument in a way. On the right over there, you have the US Capitol. At the top, you have the White House. At the bottom, you have the Jefferson Memorial, and at the left end over there, you have the Lincoln Memorial. This creates a cross-axis. The long axis, many of you probably know this, but many of you maybe don't. The horizontal axis here is the axis of the legislative branch. The vertical axis is the axis of the executive branch, okay? And they intersect at, what's in the middle? Somebody. It's tall, it's an obelisk. The Washington Monument, yes, correct, thank you. It's not exactly on center because the ground conditions in Washington, D.C., which is a swampy place, were too soft to put an obelisk of that weight, so it's not, instead of right at the crosshairs, it's just a little bit off. But that's the logic of Washington, is that there are these two axes. By the way, another thing that now happens at the crossing of the two axes is the World War II Memorial. And we had the designer of the World War II Memorial as a guest in an earlier class, and it's fascinating. But what I really want one day is to get Maya Lin and the designer of the World War II Memorial together at the table, because their approach is completely different. And it's really helpful to clarify sometimes by juxtaposing things. So that's the background of the site. Now, the location of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is not in a prominent location. It's not at the intersection of the axes. It's not on either of the axes. It's in a grove of trees. That's true of the Korean War Memorial as well, and several other memorials. I actually, as a side note, a couple of friends of mine and I submitted an entry to the now recently completed Martin Luther King Memorial it's also on the mall, and it has a more prominent location because it is, and this is brilliant, when your city plan actually has a narrative intention, then subsequent additions to it can build on that narrative. So one end of the mall I told you, they call the legislative axis, the horizontal axis, they call that the mall. So at the left end of that is the Lincoln Memorial. And at the bottom, I told you, is the Jefferson Memorial. So the Martin Luther King Memorial is on a line between Lincoln and Jefferson, which many people would argue is exactly where it should be, as King was completing the work, attempting to complete, furthering the work, let's put it that way, that Lincoln had restarted in the United States during the Civil War, that is, establishing liberty not just for white citizens, but for all citizens, that had been begun by Jefferson with the Declaration of Independence. So Jefferson to Lincoln to King. Pretty cool that they're all right in a row and right on their own axis. So, so the, however, at the site of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, there are sight lines to the Washington Monument and to the Lincoln Memorial. So it's not on one of the axes, but you'll see in a minute that these sight lines, they played a big role in this thing. So what we're going to see right now is something that does not exactly look like a monument. It's a wall in a sort of nondescript field of trees. This is not exactly what you think of when you think of a heroic monument, right? Think about Longstreet, or you think about the Washington Monument, or you think about something like that. Here's this low thing, and here's the drawing that was submitted as the competition entry. A very simple, wide V-shape wall where the ground at the juncture of the V is the deepest, and at the ends of the walls is the shallowest. So what is this thing? Well, this is really a pretty brilliant thing. Many people in the United States called the Vietnam War a quagmire. That is a murky pit into which you slowly sink. And that term became used all the time. It's still used in reference to that war by some people, and some use it today in some of the other conflicts that are going on in the world. But the idea of a quagmire and the idea of slowly, inexorably getting into it, maybe even slowly, predictably and inexorably getting into it, is physically realized with this thing where you are simply walking along in a park and you start to walk down a very slowly shallow incline. And as you do so, you start to see some names in the wall that's holding back the earth. And the question here is really not about asserting an answer the way a traditional memorial might, or monument, Caesar is great, but rather initiating a public conversation. And I think this is the first memorial that I'm aware of that is so explicitly about ambiguity, about a lack of a black and white answer, about uncertainty, about multiple points of view. And some of those questions that it asks are, where are we? How did we get here? Who are these people? Are they all dead? What does this have to do with me? Because the audience here, this is the most visited memorial in Washington. And the audience here, we have to remember, because we're empathetic people, we're design thinkers, we empathize with others. It's not just, let's say, the relative of, it's not just the mother of a dead soldier. It's not just the child of a dead soldier. It's not just the friends or colleagues or fellow soldiers. It's also tourists. It's people too young to have any recollection whatsoever of what happened. It's people from Vietnam. It's people from other countries. In other words, the point is, such a memorial, to be really engaging, needs to be aware of more than one point of view. And this one really, really is. So here we see a typically kind of gloomy day in Washington, D.C., and we're looking at the wing of the Veterans Memorial that points directly back at Lincoln. That's the Lincoln Memorial that you see in the background. And you see this person, this woman, walking down towards us. And what she's experiencing is she's aware of the formal connection to Lincoln, especially on this fall day where the leaves are not in the way. But is this an affirmative or a subversive memorial? Is it pointing blame? We don't know. What we do know is that as she walks down, she realizes that these slabs are filled with names of the dead. And she also sees herself in the reflection of the highly polished granite. So we see the names of the dead as letters removed from the image of ourself. This affirmative or subversive, or both, question applies in winter as well, when the memorial appears like a gash in the nation's front yard. If you've ever seen some poor suburbanite's lawn after local teenagers have decided to do donuts and tear up the grass, this is what some people at the time, that's what they thought of this memorial, that this is an insult. This is a further insult to those who fought in Vietnam. That this thing that is a depression rather than a celebration, what is this all about? But the truth is, this is now the most popular memorial in all of Washington, D.C., and it is the most engaging, I think, the one that allows you to both physically experience it, walking slowly down and finding yourself well below the wall, and you realize now, wow, now there's no choice but to engage with this wall. You have fallen into this abyss, into this quagmire. Actually, you walked into it. You did it of your own volition. And I think it's pretty powerful. So let's talk now, segue quickly, to this experience map, because that's what you guys are going to do sometime in the next 10 days. The assignment is already, it will go live today. And let me be very clear. It includes two parts. There's a written part, and then there's a diagramming part. The diagramming part is where you actually make the experience map, and I'll show you some examples. Again, you already have an example from Paul Kahn in the article that I sent you all the link for. But the idea of mapping one's experience is crucial in designing experience. And experience design, as we learn from Paul Kahn and as we learn in our lives every single day, whether it's the design of apps or the design of retail stores or theme parks or airlines or websites or anything, designing experience, user experience, empathetic experience design is absolutely essential to understand moving forward. So let's use the Vietnam Veterans Memorial as an example of this. So what you do is you break up an overall experience. Like you might tell somebody, yeah, we went to Washington, D.C. and we saw the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Okay, we're not ready to assess anything yet. We need to divide that experience up into a lot of pieces. So that first thing is probably a decision to make the visit in the first place. Next is you arrive to the mall in Washington, to the site by bus or bike or on foot. Then there's the question of trying to locate it. Where is it? You may get to it, as most people do, simply by looking for a crowd of people, because there's not a lot to indicate where it is. There is a single figurative sculpture that I didn't show you, which is an interesting afterthought to the design process. It was put in to satisfy those who thought an abstract, modern memorial was just too weird. And so, slightly after the fact, a philanthropist gave money for a figurative sculpture of a sort of Rambo-like character with a bunch of bullets draped over his shoulder and a machine gun. It's completely not in keeping with the Myelin's design at all, in my view, but that's c'est la vie. They didn't ask me. Where does it begin? Now this is interesting because even though experientially you can enter from either side, and where does it begin? It begins with an ankle-high wall that you barely even notice. It's like a curb. But by the time you get to the bottom of it, it's probably 16 feet above you. So there's like a big long triangle that is the wall that has the names on it. And so it starts with, the first panel of the wall has probably a dozen names. By the time you get all the way to the middle of the memorial, every tablet, every slab has hundreds of names. And it's tricky to find the person you're looking for because they're organized in a kind of interesting way. They're organized by the year of their death. But then, within the year, they're organized by the order of their death. So it's not just alphabetical. You don't just run in and find the person. You have to kind of hunt for it. And there are ladders so you can get up close to names that are too high. And as you may know, for those of you who have visited it, there are people who help you make a rubbing. You put a piece of paper up on the wall and you rub graphite or charcoal over it to reveal the name of the loved one, and that you can take that with you as a keepsake. But what's interesting is, even though the V shape roughly corresponds with America's losses in this war, that is starting very, very small, becoming huge by 1968, 70, in that era, and then tapering off towards 1975. I say American losses. There were lots of other losses, but this is an American memorial. A sixth item, as we divide this experience into pieces, descending into the trench, engaging the names, or a single name, because you can visit there as a tourist and not necessarily know any one individual person and deal instead with the enormity of the whole thing. There's about 59,000 names on this wall. Sometimes maybe you'll make a rubbing. And seeing yourself. I think this is such a powerful thing, but it's something that doesn't really occur to you right away. When you're looking at something one way, you don't necessarily see it another way. So seeing yourself is another thing. And finally, walking up, out, and away from the memorial. So this is an example of how you parse an experience into pieces. Now, when we map experience, we do it at all kinds of places that we've talked about, some of them anyway. Starbucks certainly benefits from incredibly specific and careful experience design, which means that when you're standing in line at Starbucks, which I do regularly, there's never an accident. It's never an accident what's right next to you, right? The mugs for sale or the various things for sale are carefully laid out and the line is choreographed so that it goes by things in a certain order. Before you get close to ordering, you can look at things like coffee mugs and buying bags of coffee and various coffee-related paraphernalia. And then as you get closer, you start looking at food items that you can actually buy right now that you might not have known you were hungry for, but now realize that you are. And then as you get right up to the checkout, then of course there's often still in this day and age CDs, maybe it's because the one I go to has an older demographic, or there are cards for iTunes and so forth. But there's always something for you to be doing along that process. It doesn't just happen. Apple Store is another great example, but video games. What is a video game but a choreographed experience, right? It doesn't just happen. Somebody had to write all that code to make that happen. So that's a very intentional experience. Airlines, theme parks, casinos, etc. Last year when I put this together, I had just read a couple of collections of the great Alice Munro's short stories, and I thought they are unbelievably detailed descriptions of experience as well. So I'm going to give you some examples of experience maps so that you can know what you're doing. So as we've heard from Paul Kahn and from me, journey maps or experience maps promote emotional contact with insight, distilling research into concise, visually compelling story of the customer or user's experience. So, when you talk about a Starbucks, for example, you want to think of it as a story. And so let's see what we mean. Oh my goodness, that's interesting. Oh, there we go. Sorry. So empathy is not walking in another's shoes. Is not walking in another's shoes. First, you must remove your own. And I think that's actually a very good point, which is to empathize with another. First, you have to kind of do your best to shed your own preconceptions. Emotions determine memory. This is really important, so that you don't think that you are only mapping completely quantifiable things. What you're trying to do is quantify at least a little bit, at least in relative terms of intensity, the emotions that you feel as well as the explicit experiences that you have. So for example, if you were going to do an experience map at a Starbucks, for example, and you wanted to, one of the things we're going to do is we want to map against more than one criterion. So one criterion, one measure at a Starbucks might be speed. How fast do you get through? Were there pain points or were there real negative experiences within the larger experience of going to the Starbucks? But another one might not be about speed at all. And by the way, Starbucks doesn't want the service to be too fast because that would mean you weren't getting the experiences in the line along the way that give you the opportunity to buy other things. They want it to be quick, but not too quick, because they have multiple objectives. One of them is to sell you a lot of stuff. Another one is for you to be happy and enjoy it so you'll come back. So there are multiple things you might choose to map. So if one is speed, or let's say cost, or boredom versus interest, or something like this, it'll be great to map more than one variable of the experience. So let's say on an airline, if you go, you could map an airline for, let's say, against the criterion of efficiency or customer service, human interactions with staff. But you could also measure it against, let's say, your comfort. Those things might not be the same thing, right? Sitting in the lounge, your comfort in the transaction, either at the kiosk or at the transaction counter. You can measure against multiple things. I'd like to cite another earlier guest in this class, the great Jack Hitt, a dear friend of mine and a regular on the radio program This American Life, who did a one-man show. He's talented at everything that he does. He did a one-man show called Making Up the Truth. You might think, I think I know what that is. That's lying, right? No. Making up the truth is what we do all the time to fill in the blanks in order to make a story for ourselves that we can understand. A great example of that is this famous image. How many of you have seen this image before? Most people, I would think. So it is either an old woman with a headscarf looking down like this, or it's a young woman with her head turned looking up like that. But it can't be both. It can't be both in your brain at the same time. You can maybe alternate between the two, but your brain just can't comprehend it as both at the same time. We have to tell a story to ourselves, and then our brain is very comfortable with it. So break the journey into stages using your customer or user's point of view. So here we have this sort of image of the horizontal line. So I'm going to show you how to do it. First, break down the experience. That's very important, into a series of what I call episodes, what the professional experience designers I think usually refer to as touch points. So divide the overall experience into 8 to 12 distinct, different episodes or touch points. Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Be empathetic. Become the user, the customer, or the visitor. Okay? Evaluate each episode as positive or negative, measured against a different criteria. So, like, for example, you're going to, let's just say you do Whole Foods. I'm going to do an experience map of shopping at Whole Foods. I want you to map your experience, or a user's experience, against more than one criterion. So one criterion at Whole Foods, for example, might be it might be how well the experience of the store jibes with the identity of the store as being a place for healthy food, healthy choices, healthy options, and so forth. That's a story, and you can test every little experience you have, every episode of the experience you have at that store against that measure. How well are they living up to that message? Okay, that's one criterion. Now, another one might be ease of shopping. Another one might be ease of navigation. How easy is it to find where you're supposed to go? And those things will not align perfectly. Okay? I can't imagine any experience where where the map would be the same against different criteria. Okay? So you'll have a horizontal band, you'll have a horizontal line. Above the line will be positive experiences, below the line will be negative ones. The distance from the line will be the intensity. So a really great experience at the checkout, for example, would be marked up high above the horizontal line, quite a distance, and that's where you would mark, excellent experience at the checkout. It embodied everything about Whole Foods It embodied everything about the natural lifestyle and embodied the way the transaction occurred. It was done with I don't know, with wooden currency or something. I'm teasing. It was some, everything they did reinforced their message at that moment. Whereas another experience, like let's say picking your groceries up by car, was completely not in keeping with the message at all. There was nothing about that experience that communicated the mission of Whole Foods to me. Okay, so that might be below the horizontal line when you get to that point in your graph. I'll show you some more examples, so don't worry. But I think this is very clarifying because none of you, I'm going to assert, none of you will have done something too much like this before. I don't think. I don't know. Maybe there are some business students who have taken a course in this, but I don't think so. Not many people have done this if they're not in the field. One thing that you can also do is identify what we can call the pain points. What are the words? These are often very easy to identify, by the way. If there's somebody once did an experience map of registering for classes at Northeastern University. This was a few years ago. I think it continues to get better, but there was some part in that process that was so awful and so painful at the registrar's office that it was like off the charts. On this person was saying everything was fine, selecting them was fine, figuring out prerequisites was fine, everything was fine, and then I had to go to the registrar's office and it was awful. Well, when we zoom out and look at what it is like to register for a class at Northeastern, that's really helpful to know that. Because if we fix that one thing, then everything would be great. By the way, when you guys when you first move in to your dorms as freshmen, I know because I participated in this for the first time this year, I got a survey back from Northeastern. It was incredibly detailed about that experience. It was basically an experience map asking me to measure each point in the process. How was parking? Was there someone there to direct you? Was there somebody there to help you with a cart? How about finding the student's room? How about all these kinds of things? And that would then help them design a better experience moving forward. So I thought that was very impressive. Oops. Okay, this is it. Good. Identify what we call the pain points. Focus your attention on improving these points. And once you do that, you're an experienced designer. Okay? Now, I want you to do it. So I'm going to go through the assignment right now, and then you guys you'll get it live today at 5, and I think you should be able to handle this. So the first is select an experience with which you are quite familiar. It can be a website, a store, a facility, a club, or anything like that. But it needs to have multiple episodes that you can disaggregate, okay? It needs to have enough steps in the process that you can tease them out, break them apart, okay? And I've given you a few examples already, like obviously like a grocery store, there could be everything from maybe seeing an ad on television or in a newspaper flyer or something, going to the store, parking at the store. You could map that experience. Then you could map another experience of a person who walks to the store, and maybe you might compare those two. Anyway, so select an experience with which you are quite familiar. Provide a detailed description of the overall experience and each of the 8 to 12 episodes within it. That can be just 250 to 500 words, but that's the written part, okay? Then create a chart outlining the chain of 8 to 12 episodes along the horizontal axis. I would use Excel or a spreadsheet type program for this. That's what I would do. The truth is, if you wanted to even do it by hand and scan it and make it part of a PDF, you could do that, okay? I would do it in Excel because I think it would be easier. So you're creating a chart outlining the chain of 8 to 12 episodes along the horizontal axis, and then show the positive attributes of each episode of the experience above the horizontal line. And the more above the horizontal line, the more intense the positive is. and the negative ones below, associated with a particular episode, below it. Okay? Does everybody understand what I'm asking you to do? Okay. I'm happy to stick around and answer your questions, but for those of you who think you can handle this, that's it. I got one more thing to say. I shouldn't say that's it. The one more thing to say is we have a fabulous guest on Monday. This is going to be our last guest, and the following Monday will be our last class. It's very important for you to be at the last class. It's important for you to be at all classes, but it's especially important for you to be at the last class, which is, I guess, on, what would that be, December 1st? Yeah, Monday, December 1st. Okay, thank you very much.